2025 was a year of mixed outcomes for many African countries. One of struggle on the one hand and immense possibilities on the other. From global trade disruptions and aid cuts to conflict and the debt burden, the year brought out the strain on economies. Yet across the continent, a different story also emerged. A story of adaptation, resilience and shifting opportunity. While some economies struggled, others found new ways to grow. It was also a year that pushed Africa to rethink its place in a changing global economy. This week on the program, we look at how African economies performed in 2025 and explore how the continent responded to global trade shocks and shifting economic relations. I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. And now to take a closer look at Africa's economic story in 2025, the challenges and the opportunities, I'm joined by our panel of experts, all joining via Zoom. Joining us from Lusaka in Zambia, Dr. Francis Mangeni, advisor to the Secretary General of the African Continental Free Trade Area. From Pretoria, Sizwe Gayi, international trade lawyer and expert. And joining us from Beijing, Dr. Liu Baocheng, Dean of the Center for International Business Ethics at the University of International Business and Economics. A very warm welcome to you all. Thank you for joining in this discussion. Let me start with you, Dr. Mangeni. Africa's growth outlook, according to the African Development Bank, was 3.9% in 2025 and 4% in 2026. However, projected growth in about 21 countries in Africa is expected to exceed 5% in 2025. Which African countries clearly stood out as top performers in 2025, and what set them apart?
We are doing very well as a continent, and as you have just said rightly, we have got the fastest growing, largest number of the fastest growing economies around the world. You only have to mention Rwanda, Uganda, Ethiopia, Zambia, Cote d'Ivoire in West Africa, Nigeria as well. And the explanation for this exponential growth rates basically is around two major factors, but you can go deeper if you wish. And the major factors are reforms. So this would be the case of Rwanda, Uganda, Ethiopia, or discovery of resources, new resources, which are required for green transition. Everybody around the world is really demanding these resources to support green transition, energy transitions. So these are the main reasons why the growth rates are quite high. But we should also take into account these salient features that have been underlying factors for a very long time. The growth of the middle class, the growth of the services sector.
Right, Sizwe, let me come to you here. We've heard there's a lot of optimism in 2025 and moving into 2026, but from where you sit, what were the real engines driving economic growth in those best performing economies that Dr. Mangeni has outlined, and which regions are expected moving forward to expand or to contract the most?
Just to build on what Dr. Mangeni introduced, that 2025 is turning out to be a year of African optimism. And you will recall that the way that the year started, people were quite pessimistic with the new US administration. But the African economy is truly showing to be truly resilient on its own terms. Just at a regional level, the region that has been most impressive in terms of the data that we've looked at is the East African region, followed by West Africa, and then Southern Africa is coming in last. And if you look at it, the key drivers of growth, you're looking at tech investment, infrastructure, as well as agriculture. Within that East African region, Ethiopia is leading there, and they're expected to grow by 8.1%, whilst Uganda and Tanzania are expected to grow between 6.3% and 5.4% respectively. So, and then you move on to West Africa. I think the underlying economic drivers there are resources, obviously, with the booming mining activity in Ghana and the activities that we see in Cote d'Ivoire and Senegal. Lastly, I also touch on what is happening in Southern Africa as well. Obviously, you have South Africa, which is the most advanced industrial and financial economy in the region. Now, South Africa's economic growth is not that impressive if you look at the numbers, because up until recently, we thought we were going to go into a recession. But the recent numbers that came out indicate that we are looking at a 1.2% economic growth in 2025. Now, one has to appreciate that the 1.2% of economic growth in South Africa is from a GDP of $410 billion US dollars, whilst the 5.7%, for example, of economic growth in Ghana is from a GDP base of $88 billion US dollars.
Right.
So it's important to appreciate the bigger context.
I'll come to you in a bit, Sizwe, for that. But first, I want to rope in Dr. Liu, because, Sizwe, you did mention an interesting perspective that African countries were supposed to feel the full force of the global shocks as a result of the changes with the U.S. administration. Dr. Liu, you know, since early 2025, the world has really experienced economic shocks, including the new tariffs imposed by the U.S. and those retaliatory measures announced and implemented by U.S.'s trading partners. How has this reshaped global trade flows, and which regions are absorbing the biggest shocks?
Well, specifically the tariff from the Liberation Day in early April, they really sent quite a thrust to the global order, which is really hard-earned after the COVID, when the global economy has been on a track of recovery. And so the impact lies in multiple dimensions. One is that it is causing a major disruption in the global supply chain, and where U.S. is still the largest economy so far. So therefore, a lot more adjustment has been made. And more critically is that the volatility the Trump administration has really exhibited to the world really makes the business community very difficult to make decisions. So when he really relaxed some of the tough tariffs, and there's a rush and front loading of shipments to the U.S., and then when there's the aggravation or retaliation from the counterparts, then situation gets so tense, the business community will have to recalibrate their business decisions. Mm-hmm. So the in terms of region, China is one of the biggest U.S. trading partners. So we have been rerouting a number of shipments to other countries, and definitely ASEAN countries turn out to be the biggest Chinese trading partner over the past few years, and EU. And now, more importantly, I think we are looking at the entirely global South, particularly Africa. So over the last 1 decade, actually, we registered a double-digit growth in China-Africa trade. And this is not only happening in terms of the import and export, but rather in the direct investment in multiple type of operation, e-commerce, etc. So therefore, right, we're able to deal with that. But those other countries who are very much dependent on the U.S. Is the one that is suffering the most.
Right, Sizwe, and I'll come back to you, because building on your early point where you talked about Ethiopia growing at 8% and South Africa even growing at 1.2%. How did Africa's economies, though, fare against these global trade disruptions that Dr. Liu is talking about, trade disruptions, aid cuts, and geopolitical shocks?
Perhaps the point to look at this question is to look purely at the GDP numbers that we are seeing now up to for the first 10 months of the year. And if one looks purely at the GDP numbers, the conclusion is quite clear that there's not a single direct GDP decline that correlates with, or that is attributable to the so-called Trump tariffs. And within at least the South African business context, I mean, a few weeks ago we had the P20 here in South Africa, and I could not find any business leader that could talk to the fact that business activity has been fundamentally disrupted due to the tariffs. What has happened is that there's obviously a reduction in demand for manufactured products. But by and large, and then what we've also seen is that there's been a scaling down of certain operations, especially the automotive operations that were geared for this market. Now, it is important then for also to distinguish between the Trump rhetoric and what is actually being implemented by the Americans. What we know is actually implemented is that the US has carved out or exempted a lot of products that they need from Africa, particularly on the raw materials, on the minerals. Those continue to be exempt from tariffs. What they are looking for, they are looking to persuade European automotive manufacturers to go and locate in the US by denying them preferential market access through operations that emanate from South Africa.
Right. So let me come to you, Dr. Mangeni. We've seen resilience according to CISWA there. But do African exporters, though, have any real leverage in today's trading environment where we are seeing major economies prioritizing domestic industries over global rules? Where has African laid in 2025?
The African market, right, under the African Continental Free Trade Area, holds promising opportunities for businesses on the continent, small, medium enterprises, large enterprises, as well as foreign companies that want to locate on the continent and produce from the continent, make made in Africa products. There are lucrative opportunities on the African continent. And as a result of the shocks that Caesar has been talking about and Dr. Lee emanating from the US, we have seen many businesses doing a remodeling of their business operations and business ideas, business plans towards Africa to exploit the African market. But in addition to that, of course, we have also had to diversify our export destinations more vigorously than we were doing in the past. But also markets such as Turkey, the Gulf countries, South-South trade on the whole, whether that's under the BRICS. This is now where we really are looking. Because what's the lesson we have learned from AGOA? What we have learned is that preferential market access can look good for as long as it holds. But in the flash of a moment, it cannot be wiped away.
So let me come to you, Dr. Liu, in terms of these South-South cooperation and South-South trade that needs to be enhanced, because in 2025, China announced the extension of a zero tariff treatment to cover about 100% of tariff lines for 53 African countries. What is the broader economic significance, Dr. Liu, of China's zero tariff policy for African economies, and which sectors stand to benefit the most?
Let me add quickly a few points over the African leverage, as you discussed with Dr. Mangeni, is that I think the Africa has large leverage if they are able to make a collective action instead of handling it on individual countries or individual sectors. And the other is that the Africa can be made more attractive in terms of the critical mineral supply, and so that they can really leverage their pricing scheme. And so these are really important. As you know, for the question you raised to me, is that we are able to help the Africa in several ways, in terms of the tariff reduction and also a total package. We have been talking about a sort of a closed loop. So we give fish in terms of aid, and we teach fishing skills. We build the Luban workshop. We build the agronomics center with more farming machines, etc. We also train people over there. You look at my university. We host more than 1,000 African students on daily basis on this campus. And we also provide training program to a number of delegates from Africa in the government offices and also in business communities. And then, the fishing skills are not enough. We need to help them to build the fishing net and fishing boat. So, which means that we offer practical technology as how they can really add value to their raw materials, like how to put those fish in the can so that they can really have a higher sales price, and how to process coffee. So this is important in the end. And then we come to the lower tariff. We offer the market, because after you help them to grow the produce and to create more value for the produce, where do they realize it? So, okay, let's promote the first, the younger people, right, with e-commerce, with particularly those small businesses, and then by reducing the tariff to zero, we are able to offer tangible and immediate benefit to those who are able to really to work hard and also work smart.
So, Sizwe, your take on this, though, are there early indicators that suggest that African countries are successfully transforming this Chinese zero-tariff market access opportunity into sustainable economic growth and as well as job creation? Which countries as well are best positioned to take advantage of the zero-tariff policy?
There is no single African country that will have an ability to fully take advantage of the zero tariffs on its own. The issue boils down fundamentally to say that what Africa needs to achieve is a proper integrated African market that is capable of building meaningful value chains where raw materials can move from one African country to another. And by the time the raw material leaves Africa, it is fully beneficiated to take advantage, to gain market access meaningfully in China. And that we're only going to be able to achieve if we harmonize our policies, work on meaningful programs in terms of fixing our rail and our logistics networks to make sure that goods move cheaper within intra-Africa, so that what we ultimately, our China strategy must be able to say that our China strategy is geared towards gaining a meaningful market access and maintaining a meaningful market share on products that we can be competitive on. And here I'm referring to manufactured products, because we moved beyond raw materials, which are freely moving as matters stand. So we have to harmonize our actions on issues of trade finance, infrastructure development, ultimately geared towards creating an efficient intra-African market that can take advantage of the big Chinese market.
Right. All right, gentlemen, on that note, let's take a short break. When we return, we'll look at Africa's push for stronger regional integration and what lies ahead for the continent's economy in 2026. Do stay with us. Welcome back to Talk Africa. Let's continue with our discussion. Still with me, Francis Mangeni, Sizwe Gaye, and Dr. Liu Baocheng. Dr. Mangeni, I'll come to you here now, because the African Continental Free Trade Area is a massive opportunity for regional integration, and you've been very optimistic about 2025. What concrete progress, though, did Africa CFTA make in 2025 and that actually boosted intra-Africa trade?
So intra-Africa trade has been boosted under the African Continental Free Trade Area. We are no longer talking of this usual figure of 14 to 17% as the portion of total trade that is intra-African. I think we are now talking about a figure of 28.4% or even higher, if we include small-scale cross-border informal trade. But also the trajectory is quite high even for formal trade. Now, the most significant progress that has been made over the year is that more countries have started utilizing the African Continental Free Trade Area. All the big economies on the continent are now on board exporting from one country to the other. The second one that I can mention is that we have now completed the legal architecture and the institutional architecture for the African Continental Free Trade Area. What this means that all the protocols are in place, especially the protocol on digital trade, because as you know, in this era, digital infrastructure, public digital infrastructure, is crucial, is decisive. So we now have a protocol that helps us to tap into that.
Right, Dr. Liu, let me come to you on another rather sensitive topic for the continent, the whole question of debt servicing costs that have become a significant burden for African countries. You know, they do consume an average of 27.5% of government revenues, and this was a key focus of the G20 summit recently in South Africa. How do they manage this debt crisis in 2025, and how will they fare in 2026? Dr. Liu.
Well, I think the quick solution is to renegotiate for restructuring of those debts and hopefully for haircut, if not complete relief, with those major financiers. So, but I think more fundamentally is that some of the countries who are in debt will have to prove to the global financial the community that they are able to cover those debts if they are given a better space or better window opportunity to move along through the extension program, and so the economy will be able to speak very loudly about the serviceability of those debts. So and of course the government will have to tighten their fiscal budget and also enhance a better communication with those creditors. And then by also attracting more foreign direct investment into their country, that can really help them to relieve some of the debt, and while they can also contribute to the growth of the local economy. Then to have long-term bonds over its own people domestically. Well, it is really a theoretical solution, but when people have less income, then you do not really have a large window for to tap into those shallow pockets. So these are really the considerations. But I think very practically, when China first opened its door, when we were also very much short of cash, is that we conducted something called a compensation trade. We didn't have the money, but we are able to, for example, borrow the chickens from those developed countries, and then we eventually return them with the eggs, over the chicken farm. So this is something that some African countries can consider. So to loan the equipment, even sewing machines, or the bulldozers or harvesters, and then return with the debt or loan with the end products if they can manufacture. I think that's a more practical solution.
Right. So, gentlemen, I want to get your winding up thoughts, and I'll start with you, Dr. Mangeni. What is the single biggest risk and the biggest opportunity for Africa's economies in 2026? And what is the single most important economic lesson Africa takes into 2026?
So the geopolitical situation is very volatile. We are now pivoting towards a multipolar global order, and we need to make the most of it. And to make the most of it, we need to get together as Africa to speak with one voice on the global scene, and we need to mobilize and to that effect. And then we need to utilize the African Continental Free Trade Area. It's a once in a lifetime opportunity, which we cannot afford to miss.
Dr. Liu?
The biggest risk lies in the civil war and also cross-border war, and this is only very disruptive, not only to the local life, but also frighten away a lot of good birds that can lay eggs in Africa, from the financial and business community. And then, of course, the infrastructure is still presents the bottleneck, not only in terms of roads, airports, but also in energy supply. And so the other is that the education. So only if you have the right talent people in addition to the demographic dividend, and you can really be more attractive to not only to attract foreign businesses, but also to identify more opportunities on global basis. So for opportunity, I think that's very clear. Africa has really the biggest promise and largest potential that needs to be tapped with better integration, with better harmonization, and so they can really form a better bargaining power, and also they can really leverage on the global opportunities, particularly, I think, from my standpoint, the Belt and Road program, also the China-African friendship, to really to go for a further miles of ride on the urbanization and industrialization process. So what is needed most is more initiative that is really brought forth to those countries from Africa, not just to wait under the palm tree to simply to expect a coconut. So that's something I would give advice.
Right. Sizwe, you have the final word on the single biggest risk, the biggest opportunity, and the single most important economic lesson Africa takes into 2026.
I think on this one, I'm going to shift the attention to the opportunities. Perhaps the risks are always there, but I think what comes with it is whether or not are we going to magnify the risks or are we going to magnify the opportunities. And for me, I choose to say that I think the responsibility of Africans is to magnify the opportunities, because then if we magnify the opportunities, we can then by and large lessen the risks. Not that they are not going to be there, but we can certainly lessen them. And I think what we have now is also multiple global partners from China, India, and Russia. So we have many other countries. I mean, the BRICS element is a huge element in terms of diversifying our global partnerships. We obviously will have the EU showing more predictability and stability as being a partner in Africa. But one thing that we must look at is that, with an administration like the Trump administration, I will say this, it is the perfect decolonization regime that has ever been there in America, simply because it lets Africans focus on their problems to say, let's look for ourselves for the solutions that we need to craft the future that we want to craft. And that talks to how we invest in education, how we invest on our own programs. And we must not look into only governments on this. It is a responsibility of the private sector, ordinary citizens on the ground, to say, what do we mobilize within the legal frameworks that have been created? It's one thing for governments to go and negotiate the African Free Trade Area, but the question is then what happens to our financial institutions, the conglomerates that are in the African continent, which must then in turn turn that into practical opportunities. So a lot of work lies ahead. I'm not trying to minimize that at all. It will take the collective discipline, but the solutions lie with Africans. I mean, there are pockets of instability all over the world, but I think in the greater scheme of things, you are always able to magnify the bigger opportunities.
Gentlemen, thank you all very much for looking at African economies in 2025 and looking forward into 2026. But that's all we have time for on this edition of Talk Africa. A big thank you to our guests, Dr. Francis Mangeni, Advisor to the Secretary General of the African Continental Free Trade Area, Sizwe Gayi, International Trade Lawyer and Expert, and Dr. Liu Baocheng, Dean of the Center for International Business Ethics at the University of International Business and Economics. Remember, you can be a part of this conversation through our social media platforms on Facebook and X, and you can watch this and other editions of Talk Africa on our YouTube playlist. Do join us again next week for more Talk Africa. From me, Beatrice Marshall, and the team here in Nairobi, until next time, it's goodbye.